11 tons of barley stamped no good. She soaked a handful and watched it sprout anyway. The buyer had already written her off entirely. Grandfather's thermometer, a bucket of water, and a rejection slip nobody believed. 2 years later, every distillery in the state wanted her rejected grain. The dump truck's hydraulics whined and the bed climbed, and 11 tons of 1987 barley came down onto the gravel floor of Maggie Holloway's barn lot in a dry roar that sounded like a river made of gravel. Dust rolled out the open door. It smelled like a cellar. It smelled like something that had been shut in the dark too long and had gotten opinions about it. Maggie stood square-shouldered at the edge of it in her faded olive canvas jacket, hands on her hips, dark auburn braid down her back, and watched the pile settle into itself. Dale Pritchard did not get his shoes dirty. That's the first thing you should know about him. He stayed up on the concrete apron in those polished black lace-ups, charcoal jacket, maroon tie, rimless glasses catching the November light, and he flipped up the hinged lid of that chrome clipboard and read the numbers out loud like he was doing a public service. Lot 411, 1987 barley, rejected at 14.8% moisture. Visible mold on the outer sacks. Dockage past tolerance. Co-op writes it off at $75 a load. Disposal. He capped his pen and tapped the clipboard twice with it. That's $450 we're not paying the landfill, honey. And you get free bedding straw. Everybody wins. Free bedding straw. 11 tons of grain, and the man's whole imagination stopped at something to put under a cow. Then he said the part that stuck. I'll be honest with you. I wasn't sure you'd still be out here. 61 acres of rock and a girl with no equipment. He smiled. He had a very patient smile. Josiah kept this place alive on stubbornness, and stubbornness doesn't service a note. When you're ready to be realistic, come see me. There's no shame in it. Some ground was never meant to carry anybody. She didn't answer him. She never did. That's the thing about Maggie Holloway that Dale Pritchard filed under slow. She let a sentence like that land, and she let it sit there in the air going stale, and she just looked at the pile. Gray-green eyes, freckles across the nose, that little pale thumbprint birthmark under her left ear. 24 years old, and she'd already learned the most expensive lesson there is. Arguing with a man like that is free advertising for his opinion. He signed the manifest, handed her the pink copy, and drove off in a car with no mud on it. 2 years earlier, Josiah Holloway had died in the front room with a wood stove going and the radio on. He left her 61 acres of thin Kentucky hill ground, clay that goes to brick in August and soup in March, half of it too steep to plow, a barn with a good roof and bad doors, 11 ewes, a shed full of tools with hickory handles worn to the shape of one man's grip, and no cash. No credit either. The bank had looked at her application, looked at the acreage, and used the phrase insufficient collateral with the tenderness of someone reading a weather report. And the journals, 11 of them, spiral-bound, feed store cheap, kept in a wooden crate under the workbench. She read them at night at the kitchen table, with the brass-cased pocket thermometer still hanging on its leather cord around her neck, because she'd stopped taking it off sometime that first winter. His handwriting was blocky pencil, all capitals, pressed hard enough to emboss the back of the page. Rainfall totals, lambing dates, what a ewe ate and what came of it. Little notes to himself in the margins, arguments he was having with the world at a distance of 30 years. And on the inside cover of the third book, underlined twice, "Nothing is spoiled until it stops wanting to grow." He'd written it about a bin of soft potatoes in 1974. She'd read it maybe 40 times without it meaning much. That afternoon, it meant something. Earl Bowman came down the road about 4 o'clock and leaned his forearms on the top rail of her fence, the way he'd been leaning on that same rail since before she was born. Stocky, barrel-chested, the faded navy feed store cap, white stubble kept short, thermos in his fist with that dent in the cap. He looked at the pile. He looked at her. He took his time. "That's Dale's junk barley." "It's mine now." Earl unscrewed the thermos, poured, drank, screwed it back. "You want the polite version or the real one?" "Polite's fine." "Polite is, folks think you got taken." He hooked a thumb in his pocket. "Real one is, Nadine Coffey told the whole church you paid nothing for 11 tons of nothing, and that's about the exchange rate on this place. They're not mean about it. They just already decided how this ends." She nodded, slow. Didn't flush, didn't flinch. "How's your knee?" "Bad." He laughed once, short, and looked at the barley again with something almost like regret. "Your granddad'd have had a use for it." "I know." He went home. The light went orange, then blue, then gone. Here's what nobody in Adair County understood about that pile, and what Dale Pritchard's clipboard was never going to tell him. Moisture at 14.8% isn't death. It's the number where a grain elevator starts sweating about storage, because at that moisture, a bin heats, and a bin spoils, and a bin costs a co-op money. It's a warehouse number, a liability number. It has absolutely nothing to say about whether the seed inside the hull is alive. Mold on the outer sacks means the outer sacks got wet. It does not mean the 10 tons behind them died in sympathy. And a barley kernel is not a commodity. A barley kernel is an embryo in a lunchbox, sitting there with its starch packed around it, waiting for one single signal from the outside world. Water. Have you ever looked at something everyone you know has already written off and felt the back of your neck go cold because you suspect they're wrong? She got a coffee can out of the shed, punched the label off with her thumb, walked out into the dark to that mountain of condemned grain, dug her arm in past the elbow, warm in there, warm the way a haystack is warm, and came up with 2 handfuls from the center. Well water from the kitchen tap, cold enough to ache. She filled the can, set it on the windowsill above the sink, and sat down at the table under the one bulb with Josiah's 3rd journal open in front of her, and did not sleep much. Sunrise came gray and low. She looked in the can.
Every kernel had split its hull, and out of every split came a white rootlet, blind and... She counted them out on a dish towel at the kitchen table. 100 kernels in 10 rows of 10, and the light coming through the window was still gray. 87 of them had pushed a white rootlet through the hull. Little pale threads, thinner than sewing thread, curled and searching. 13 sat dead and dull. 87% germination. Sit with that number a second. The buyer at the elevator had looked at 400 bushels of her grandfather's barley and called it garbage. Not unfit for malting. Garbage. Docked it, refused it, offered her feed price like he was doing her a kindness, and told her, with that patient little smile people use on somebody they've already decided is stupid, "Sweetheart, this isn't a hobby crop. You're out of your depth." The barley was alive. It was wet, and it was ugly. And the kernels were spotted and uneven in size, which is a cosmetic problem and a storage problem, and not a life problem. The rejection had been for moisture and appearance. The seed didn't care. The seed still wanted to grow. Maggie wrote 87 over hundredths in the margin of Josiah's journal and underlined it twice. Then came the part nobody teaches you.
There was a pamphlet in the bottom drawer of the desk. Extension Service, 1954. The cover gone soft as cloth from handling. Farm-scale malting of small grains. 22 pages, 3 diagrams, and a tone so dry it could cure ham. Her grandfather had written in it, corrections mostly. Where the pamphlet said 48 hours of steeping, Josiah had crossed it out and put, "Too long for our barley, 40 hours, air rests." Where it described a kiln, he'd sketched something in the margin with arrows for airflow and the note, "Heat is easy. Moving heat is the whole job." 3 steps. That's malting. You steep the grain in water until it wakes up. You let it germinate on a floor until the starch inside converts to something a brewer can actually use. Then you kiln it, dry it down, and stop the process cold before the sprout eats everything you just made. Steep, germinate, kiln. Simple the way a violin is simple. She built the steep tank out of a galvanized stock watering trough she dragged out of the fence line, hosed down and scrubbed with vinegar until her forearms ached and the metal squeaked. The trough held about 140 gallons. The well pump on the barn line was shot, so she hauled water in 5-gallon buckets from the house spigot, and it took 31 trips per fill, and she counted every one. She rigged a scrap garden hose over the lip as a drain, siphon-fed, so she could pull the water down without tipping 400 pounds of soaking grain on her boots. The brass thermometer on its leather cord came off her neck and went into the water. 58 degrees. Her grandfather's number, written in his hand in the pamphlet's margin. Too warm and the grain drowns itself. Too cold and it sulks and does nothing. 58. 40 hours of steeping, broken into wet stretches and air rests. 8 hours under, 8 hours drained and breathing, then under again. Grain needs oxygen as much as water. Drown it, and you've got a trough of expensive mush. She set an alarm clock on a milk crate beside the trough and slept in the barn in her canvas jacket with a wool blanket over her legs. By hour 40, the kernels had swelled fat and pale and smelled faintly of cucumber. That's the smell. That's the seed deciding to live. Then she shoveled it onto the floor. The couching floor was the old milk house concrete, scrubbed twice and rinsed 3 times,
and she spread the wet grain about 4 inches deep across maybe 200 square feet. Here's the thing about germinating grain that the pamphlet says flatly and without drama. It generates its own heat. Thousands of kernels, all respiring at once, all burning sugar, and if you leave them alone, the bed goes hot in the middle, and the rootlets tangle into each other, and the whole thing mats into a solid felt mattress that has to be cut out with a spade and thrown away. So you turn it every 4 hours, day and night. She made a rake out of an oak board and a broom handle, wide teeth, no metal, because metal bruises the acrospire, the shoot growing up under the husk, and that shoot is the whole point. Break it, and that kernel is dead weight. 4 in the afternoon, 8 at night. Midnight, 4 in the morning, 8, noon. Walking the bed in slow lanes, folding the warm grain up from the bottom, feeling with the flat of her hand for hot spots. 64 degrees was the target on the floor. The thermometer went in at 4 points every turn, and she wrote all 4 numbers down. 5 days of that. 5 days of a woman with a thick auburn braid down her back sleeping in 90-minute pieces, waking with grain dust in her eyelashes, hands on her hips at 3 in the morning, staring at a concrete floor, breathing gently like something asleep. By day 5, the rootlets were curled tight, and the acrospire had run about 3/4 the length of the kernel. She chewed one. It broke, sweet and chalky, and gave. Green malt.
Alive. And now the clock was against her, because every hour it kept growing was an hour it was eating the sugar she needed. Which brought her to the kiln. She didn't have a kiln. She had a hayloft over the barn's south end, and a cast-iron wood stove she and Earl Bowman had wrestled up the stairs the week before. Earl saying almost nothing the entire time, which, for Earl, counted as encouragement. She laid a bed of grain on window screen over sawhorses, 4 inches deep, fired the stove with dry ash, and stood there in the rising heat with the thermometer in her fist. 40 pounds. Her first test batch. It was wrong within an hour, and she knew it. The screens nearest the stovepipe went bone dry and then browner than brown, while the far corner sat clammy and cool as a cellar. No fan, no stack. No way to pull air up through the bed instead of letting it wander sideways across the top. Heat was easy. Moving heat was the whole job, and she hadn't moved a damn thing. What came down those loft stairs smelled like a barn fire in a hayfield. Scorched, flat, hollow, useless. She sat at the kitchen table with the gray light going and opened the journal to the page under Josiah's own slanted handwriting, and she wrote it down. Batch 1, 40 pounds, no airflow, no bed depth control, uneven heat, scorched edges, wet center, total loss. Then, the smell doesn't wash out. 3 days, 2 loads of laundry, and that faded olive green canvas jacket still carries the ghost of scorched hay every time she moves her arms. Maggie doesn't bother trying again. She just wears it into the barn on a Tuesday morning with a wrecking bar in her hand and tears the loft floor out, board by board. Here's what she figured out, sitting at the kitchen table with Josiah's journal open and the brass thermometer cold against her collarbone. The heat wasn't the problem. The heat was fine. The problem was that hot air is lazy. It takes the easiest path it can find, and a solid plank floor with a few drilled holes gives it exactly 1 easy path and 900 hard ones. So the grain sitting over the holes cooked black, and the grain sitting over the planks stayed damp and sour, and the whole 40 pounds came out tasting like a chimney fire. Air doesn't spread out on its own. You have to make it. So she builds a floor that's mostly not there. Oak slats, a 1/4 inch apart, laid across joists she salvaged from the old hogshed. And over that, a sheet of perforated steel she buys from a scrap dealer in Somerset for $11. Punched with holes the size of a pencil eraser, hundreds of them, dense and even. Under it all, she frames a plenum out of flat sheet metal, a shallow sealed box that catches the heat from the firebox below and forces it to pressurize before it can go anywhere. Pressure is the trick. Pressure makes the air push up through every hole at once instead of racing for the loose one. And she runs a stovepipe chimney out the loft gable, 8 inches wide, 6 feet tall. Because you can't push air into a room that's already full. Something has to pull. The grain bed she keeps to 8 inches. Deeper than that, and the bottom scorches before the top gives up its water. Shallower, and she's wasting a whole day of fire on nothing. Then comes the part that makes her look like a lunatic to anyone driving past. She tears a bedsheet into strips of muslin, and for 2 straight weeks, she stands at the open firebox door, holding a strip out in front of her at arm's length, watching how it moves. If it flutters, the draft is uneven. If it sags, there's no pull at all. If it kicks sideways, something's leaking. She wants one thing and one thing only. A strip that lifts and holds, straight and steady, like a flag in a slow, constant wind. It takes her 19 tries. She caulks the plenum seams with fire clay. She lengthens the chimney another 2 feet. She cuts a lower air intake under the firebox door and learns she has to damper it down to about 1/3, or the fire roars and drags the heat straight up the flue without ever touching the grain. Meanwhile, she's learning the curve, and the curve is the whole religion. 24 hours at 120 degrees, not higher. Josiah wrote it twice in the journal, underlined the second time. And now she understands why. Green malt is roughly 45% water, and inside every one of those kernels is a set of enzymes the sprouting barley built to convert its own starch into sugar. Those enzymes are the entire product. That's what a brewer is buying. And they die above 140 when the grain is wet. So you dry it slow and cool, and the moisture carries the heat away. And only when the kernel is down under 10% water do you dare start climbing. Then you ramp. 140, 160, and finally 180 for the last 3 hours to set the color and cook the flavor in. Pale gold, sweet, not toast, not char, gold. She writes the numbers on the barn wall in carpenter's pencil so she doesn't have to hunt the journal in the dark. January nearly ends her. A cold snap comes down out of Ohio and sits on Pulaski County for 6 days. And the steep water in the galvanized tank skins over with ice a 1/2 inch thick at 4 in the morning. Barley that's been chilled to 34 degrees does not germinate. It just sits there, wet and sullen and waiting to rot. She loses 180 pounds of soaked grain to a stalled germination. Pulls a handful out on day 4, and the acrospires haven't moved a millimeter. And by day 6, the smell coming off it is a wet basement smell. And that's that. She shovels it to the compost pile with her jaw set and her breath hanging white, and doesn't say a word about it to anybody. That night, she sits at the table with the ledger and the loan papers from the Somerset Bank still in the drawer where Dale Pritchard left them. And she does the arithmetic on selling. Have you ever been the only person who thinks a thing will work? She opens the journal instead. And on a page she hadn't reached yet, in her grandfather's cramped hand, the land doesn't need a whip. It needs a meal. Feed the grain, feed the fire, feed the weight. Everything that's ever worked slow. She goes back out at 5 and lags the steep tank with straw bales and old horse blankets, and moves the whole operation into the barn's south corner, where the block wall holds the day's heat. 3 mornings later, there's a load of split hickory at her gate. Face cord, maybe better, stacked neat, cut to 18 inches. Hickory, which burns hot and clean and long, which is exactly what a malt kiln wants, and exactly what she can't afford. No note. But she knows a stack when she sees one, and she knows Earl Bowman's bow-legged boot prints in the frost. And when she sees him at the co-op that Friday, with his thumbs hooked in his pockets and that dented thermos under his arm, he looks at the floor and says, "Cold snap." That's the entire conversation. It's the most anyone in that county has said to her in 8 months. On February the 9th, at 4:10 in the afternoon, she holds a strip of muslin out at the firebox opening, and it lifts and pulls straight and steady and does not waver. She climbs the ladder, rakes the bed, and the barley comes off the steel pale gold, dry as sand, 200 pounds of it. And when she puts a kernel between her back teeth, it cracks clean and floury and tastes like sugar. 200 pounds of pale gold malt in feed sacks, and nobody in the county who wants it. That's the part they don't tell you about building something from scratch. You solve the impossible problem, the germination bed, the draft, the kiln that smoked back at you for 6 weeks straight. And then you're standing in a drafty barn in Casey County, Kentucky, with 8 burlap sacks stacked against the wall, and the whole world shrugs. Casey County grows barley. It doesn't malt it. Barley here goes into a hopper, gets rolled flat, and gets fed to cattle. That's the entire ecosystem. Asking a feed dealer to buy malted barley is like asking a gas station to stock vintage wine. They'll be polite about it for maybe 90 seconds. Maggie loaded 40 pounds in the truck and drove to Liberty. The dealer there lifted a handful, let it run through his fingers, and asked what she'd done to it. She told him. Steeped, sprouted 5 days, kilned dry at 122 degrees for 18 hours, then finished at 175. He nodded, the way men nod when they've stopped listening. Said he'd give her cattle grain price, $4 a hundredweight, and he'd have to think about even that, because malted grain confuses his customers. Second dealer, over in Dunville, didn't even get out of his chair. The homebrew shop was 3 counties over, in a strip mall next to a tanning salon, and the guy behind the counter actually cared. You could see it. He pinched a kernel, bit it, said, "Huh," said it tasted clean. Then he offered her 12 cents a pound. 12. She'd put 5 days of steeping water and a cord of hardwood and roughly 90 hours of her own labor into that grain. And the going rate for enthusiasm was 12 cents. She didn't argue. She never argues. She said thank you, put the sample back in her jacket pocket, and drove home with the heater rattling. Here's what she did instead of complaining. She went into the kitchen, got a half-gallon mason jar, and crushed 2 ounces of her own malt with a rolling pin. Not to flour, just cracked, husks intact, because the husks are the filter bed, and pulverizing them turns the whole mash into wallpaper paste. Grandfather's brass-cased pocket thermometer came off the leather cord around her neck and went into the water. She held it at 152 degrees for an hour, wrapping the jar in a bath towel and nudging it with hot water from the kettle whenever the needle sagged. Fair skin flushed at the cheekbones from the steam. Auburn braid pushed back over her shoulder. Gray-green eyes on that needle like it owed her money. At the 60-minute mark, she drew a spoonful onto a white saucer and let a single drop of tincture of iodine fall into it. Starch turns iodine blue-black. Sugar leaves it brown. The drop stayed amber. Full conversion. Every bit of starch in that grain had been chewed into fermentable sugar by enzymes her own kiln hadn't cooked to death. Which was the whole gamble, because that's what heat does. Push the kiln too hot, and you get beautiful colored malt with dead enzymes, pretty and useless. She'd run it low and slow on purpose, and the amber drop on that saucer said she'd been right. Then she got the number that mattered: diastatic power. It's a measure of enzyme strength, how much starch a malt can convert beyond its own weight. Scored in degrees Lintner. Anything above 35 will convert itself. Above 100, and you can carry unmalted grain along with it. She sent a 2-pound sample to a lab in Louisville for $38 and waited 11 days. And the sheet came back. 118 degrees Lintner. Extract at 78%. Moisture 4. 1. Commercial pale malt, freighted in from Wisconsin, was landing at Kentucky breweries for 38 cents a pound. Hers came out of ground she owned, on wood she cut, in a shed her grandfather framed in 1961 and never finished. She had a product that was measurably good and a county that measurably did not care. Word travels in small places, and it travels crooked. By March, she was the rot farmer, because somebody had seen the steeping tanks and the sprouting grain and decided that wet barley heaped on a floor was barley going bad. At the feed store counter, men laughed about it openly, not even behind their hands. Earl Bowman heard it, worked his thumbs into his pockets, said nothing, and poured coffee from that dented steel thermos while a younger man did an impression of her sniffing a handful of mold. Have you ever done everything right and had the world grade you on what it assumed you were doing? The co-op annual meeting was the first Tuesday of April in the elementary school cafeteria, folding chairs and burnt coffee and 140 farmers. Dale Pritchard ran the presentation, because Dale Pritchard runs presentations. Charcoal suit jacket, maroon tie, rimless glasses catching the fluorescence, polished black shoes on a floor that had never seen a shine like that. Chrome clipboard in one hand, capped pen tapping the hinged lid, tap, tap, like a metronome for other people's patience. He walked them through nitrogen programs, yield contracts, a slide about operations that scale versus operations that entertain. And then he smiled out at the room and delivered his little joke. We've got contracts available for every serious grower in this county. And for the rest, well, I hear there's real money in soaking your crop until it sprouts. Ask the Holloway girl. She's proven a woman can lose a farm slower than a man can. The room laughed. Not all of it. Enough. He let it run, then added, warm as pie, "No offense, sweetheart. Some folks just inherit a hobby and mistake it for a business." That's the thing about men like Dale. They never raise their voice. They knife you in a pleasant tone and then look wounded if you flinch. Maggie stood up in the back, olive canvas jacket, dust still at the knees of her jeans, brass thermometer swinging once against her chest as she rose. Square shoulders, absolutely still. The room turned to watch whether she'd cry or shout, because those were the only two options anybody had planned for. She looked at Dale Pritchard, and she said 6 words. "I'll need a receipt for my dues." Then she walked out, and the door swung shut behind her. The truck rattled the whole way home with 11 sacks of unsold malt shifting in the bed, and Maggie didn't turn the radio on. 50 pounds each, 550 pounds of 2-row barley she'd germinated by hand, kilned over 3 days, and hauled 40 miles to a room full of men who thought her name was a punchline. It rode home with her. That's the part nobody tells you about being right too early. You have to carry the evidence back yourself. The bank called on a Thursday. Harlan Vesey at First Ridge had a proposition, and he laid it out with the warm voice of a man doing you an enormous favor. $9,000, operating loan, 12%. Enough to cover feed, taxes, propane, and the roof. Enough to get her through to spring without eating into the seed money. And it was contingent on one small thing. Just a formality, really. The barn lot. The 4 acres of frontage along Cane Ridge Road, collateralized and, in the event of default, sold for road access to the parcel behind it. The parcel Dale Pritchard's co-op had been quietly optioning for 18 months for a grain terminal. "Now, I want you to understand," Harlan said, sliding the papers across. "Nobody's trying to take anything from you. It's just that the bank has to look at the whole picture. And the whole picture, Miss Holloway, no offense meant, is a young woman sprouting barley in a hayloft. That's not a business. That's a hobby your granddaddy left you." He smiled. "The land, now. The land's worth something." Read that back. The land's worth something. Meaning she wasn't. She took the papers home and set them on the kitchen table and didn't sign them. Not that night. Not the next. Then it started raining. 9 days. Not storms. The flat, gray Kentucky kind that just sits on you. 61 degrees and saturated. Dew point riding right up against the air temperature so nothing dries and everything breathes. The loft roof went first, a slow seep along the north purlin where the tin had lifted in an August wind she'd meant to fix. Water came down onto the east end of the germination floor. Maggie moved 400 pounds of steeping barley by hand in the dark with a grain scoop and a wheelbarrow. And then she climbed up and nailed roofing felt over the leak from the inside, on her back, water running down her sleeves into her armpits, the brass thermometer on its leather cord swinging against her chin. And here's the thing about a wet floor in a wet week. Barley doesn't just sit there. It's alive. Every kernel is respiring, throwing off heat and carbon dioxide. And in a bed 4 inches deep across a loft floor, that heat stacks. Get above 70 and the rootlets mat. The bed goes anaerobic and you get mold. A gray bloom that smells like a cellar and turns $500 of barley into hog feed. Josiah's journal said it in 6 words on page 91. A malt bed sleeps. Do not smother it. So for 9 days, she turned it every 4 hours. Midnight, 4, 8, noon, 4, 8. A wooden rake, hand-cut, 48 inches wide, dragged the length of the floor and back so the bottom came up and the top went down, and the heat bled off into the loft air. 64 degrees. She checked with the brass thermometer, pushed down into the bed to the second joint of her finger, and pulled it out and held it to the lantern, with rain hammering the tin 18 inches over her head. 64. 65. Rake it down to 64. She slept in 90-minute pieces on a horse blanket at the top of the stairs. Have you ever bet everything you had on an idea nobody else could see? Not a little. Everything. The land, the years, the good opinion of every person you grew up around. And then had to keep getting up at 4 in the morning to tend the idea. Alone, in the rain, with the loan papers sitting on your kitchen table like a door standing open. That's where she was. Day 9, 2 in the morning, auburn braids soaked through and stuck to her back, hands cracked at the knuckles, forearms shaking from the rake. She came down out of the loft and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the $9,000 under her right hand. 12%, 4 acres. Warm house all winter. She didn't sign it. She reached past it and opened the journal instead. March 1962. Josiah's handwriting, tight and slanted. The corn that year had gone down in a wet spring, and every man on the ridge called it ruined and disked it under for insurance money. Josiah left his standing. Let it dry on the stalk into October, harvested it at 18% moisture, and sold it as distiller's corn to a Bardstown house that paid a nickel over cash price because the starch had converted clean. 640 bushels off 11 acres. And under it, the line she'd read 100 times and never once needed the way she needed it right then. Waste is just a failure of imagination. They saw a ruined field. I saw a slow one. She sat with that. Then she put her boots back on and walked out into the rain. The loft smelled like bread, not mold. Not the sour cellar smell she'd been dreading for 9 days. It smelled sweet and clean and faintly of cucumber, which is what green malt smells like when the enzymes are running right and the starch is breaking to sugar in every kernel at once. She knelt and pushed her hand down into the bed, warm as a sleeping animal. She held the thermometer up to the lantern. 64 degrees. Dead on. She raked a hand through the top layer. The rootlets were out. White, hair-like, uniform. 3/4 the length of the kernel across the whole floor. East end to west end. Every grain moving at the same speed. She bit one. It broke, chalky and sweet, against her teeth. That's the proof. Not a feeling, a number, a smell, and a bed of grain, the exact temperature it was supposed to be. Maggie walked back to the house with rain on her face and picked up the loan application. And she opened the stove door and fed it in, corner first, and watched $9,000 go orange and curl and go out. It cost her the winter. She knew it would. The paper caught fast. Loan applications burn clean, thin stock, no gloss. And Maggie stood there in the olive canvas jacket with her arms crossed and watched 8% interest turn into curl and smoke. Then she shut the firebox door, went out in the dark and filled a 50-pound sack from the finished bin. She didn't sell that sack. She gave it away. Here's the thing nobody tells you about selling something the market has never heard of. You can't price it. You can't advertise it. There's no line item on any purchase order in the Commonwealth of Kentucky that says, floor malted 2-row from a hill farm in Casey County. So the only move left is the one that feels like surrender and isn't. You put it in their hands for free and let the grain do the talking. Maggie drove to the county library in Liberty and asked for the state directory of licensed distilled spirits producers and brewers. 1988. The list was short. A lot of the big names, a scatter of new ones, small operations with post office boxes for addresses and permits less than 2 years old. She copied out 11 of them in pencil. Not the giants. The giants had contracts with pneumatic maltsters in the Midwest, steel drums the size of grain silos that could turn out 40 tons in 5 days and never once let a human hand touch the bed. 11 small ones. 11 5-pound samples, brown paper, twine, her name and the farm's box number in block letters, and a single index card in each one that said, floor malted, kilned over hardwood, 1988 harvest. No charge. Mash it and tell me what you find. 55 pounds of grain and $11 in postage. That was the whole marketing budget. 10 of them never answered. Not a call, not a card. 2 of the packages came back stamped undeliverable, which is its own particular flavor of humiliation when you've been eating beans for 4 months. The 11th answered on a Tuesday. A startup outfit in Bardstown, 3 men and a leased warehouse and a still they'd bought secondhand out of Tennessee. They'd run her 5 pounds as a test mash against the imported base malt they'd been buying by the pallet. Same water, same yeast, same temperature, same everything. And they called her because they couldn't explain what happened. The wash came out cleaner, sweeter. The imported malt gave them a flat, papery sugar and a haze they had to fight. Hers came off the mash tun bright, with a nose on it like fresh bread and honey, and a fermentation that took off in 9 hours instead of 18. Now let me tell you why. Because this is the whole hinge of everything. Industrial pneumatic malting is a machine trying to be a floor. It moves the grain mechanically, turns it with augers, blows conditioned air through it at a fixed rate, and pushes the whole batch from steep to kiln in about 5 days because time is money and consistency is the only god. It works. It makes perfectly acceptable malt, but it bruises the corn. Microfractures in the endosperm from all that mechanical turning, and it kilns fast and hot, which drives off the delicate stuff, the light esters, the honeyed notes that live in the first 30 degrees of heat. Maggie's floor did none of that. Her germination took 7 days at 58 degrees because that's what her stone floor held, and she turned the bed by hand with a wooden rake, and the roots knitted into each other and pulled apart gentle. Her kiln ran low and slow over hardwood,
20 hours in the 50s before she ever pushed past 90, because her grandfather's brass-cased thermometer hung around her neck and she'd been taught to read it like a pulse. That slowness left something in the grain, a profile, a fingerprint that 40-ton steel drums physically cannot reproduce, because the thing that makes it is time. And time is exactly what the machine was built to eliminate.
And here's the part that would have made Josiah Holloway laugh out loud in his own barn. In 1988, in Kentucky, a whole generation of small distillers was waking up starving for exactly that. The craft boom was 6 months old, and nobody had named it yet. Little licenses coming through by the dozen. Men and women with a single pot still and an obsession. All of them looking for one thing they could point at and say, "This is why ours tastes different." They didn't want efficient. They had no way to compete on efficient. They wanted a story with sugar in it. She had 11 acres of it sitting in her barn. Word moved the way word moves in that business, not through advertising, through a man telling another man over a glass at 4 in the afternoon. And in early March, a slate blue Volvo came up the gravel with Louisville plates, and a woman got out who did not belong on that road. Claire Vantine, 38, ash blonde hair side-parted and tucked behind one ear, slate blue wool blazer over a cream turtleneck, low black boots she did not seem worried about ruining. She had a small brass-cornered notebook with a rubber band around it, and she didn't small talk. She asked to see the floor. Maggie took her in, auburn braid down her back, dust at the knees, hands on her hips while the buyer walked the germination bed. Vantine crouched, put her palm flat on the grain to feel the heat coming off it, picked up a kernel, split it with a thumbnail, checked the acrospire against the length of the corn, chewed a piece of finished malt slow, arms folded, chin lifted, staring at nothing. Then she asked the only question that ever actually matters. How many tons can you guarantee me by fall? Not, is it good? Not, how do you do it? Volume. The question you only ask when you've already decided. Maggie didn't blink. 11, maybe 12 if the weather holds. Price: 41 cents a pound, cash on delivery, and I don't sign exclusive. Vantine's eyebrow moved about a quarter inch. Everybody signs exclusive. Those are my terms. Do the arithmetic on that, because Maggie already had, 3 times, at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning. 11 tons is 22,000 pounds. 22,000 pounds at 41 cents is $9,020. Off grain that Dale Pritchard had personally, smilingly, called worthless feed corn from a dead man's dirt. Claire Vantine took the rubber band off her notebook. Maggie didn't answer fast. She stood there in the barn doorway with her hands on her hips, square-shouldered, the brass-cased thermometer swinging slow against her chest. And she did the arithmetic in her head the way her grandfather did it. Floor space, turning time, kiln hours, the length of an October. 6,000 pounds, she said, by October. Not a pound more until I know I can hold the quality. Claire Van Tyne put out her hand. Ivory skin, that faint birthmark just above the right wrist, the little brass-cornered notebook tucked under her arm with its rubber band. They shook in the doorway with grain dust hanging in the light between them. And that handshake was worth more than every loan officer in 3 counties. Then came the work. The old milking parlor had been sitting empty since before Maggie was born. Concrete floor, drain trough down the middle, a smell of iron and sour milk baked into the walls. She scrubbed it for 11 days. Lye, wire brush, a garden hose, knees raw. Concrete is the right floor for germinating barley because it pulls heat down and out of the bed. And that drain trough meant steep water had somewhere to go. She patched 2 cracks, leveled a low corner with a bag of mix, and by August, she had a second germination floor, 400 square feet of it, and a kiln twice the size of the first, built off the old smokehouse frame with a firebox she could feed from outside, and a perforated deck of expanded metal she bought as scrap for $60. She hired 2 hands. Local boys' fathers, actually. Men in their 40s who'd been laid off the crushed stone quarry, glad for $11 an hour, and a woman who told them exactly what she wanted and never raised her voice about it. And then, right on schedule, the system broke. Second week of September, warm, 84 degrees and thick air like a wet towel. She'd laid the new floor 8 inches deep because 8 inches meant more pounds per turn, and she was chasing a number now instead of listening to the grain. Barley germinating is a furnace. Every kernel waking up is burning sugar and throwing heat, and 8 inches of it packed on warm concrete on a warm night is a compost pile with ambitions. She came in at 4 in the morning and smelled it before she saw it. Not the cucumber and fresh bread smell of good green malt, something sweeter, sicker, with a fur on the back of it. She pushed the brass thermometer into the bed and it read 96 degrees and climbing. She dug down with both hands and the center of the pile was hot enough to hurt, and the rootlets had knitted into a mat, and the mat was gone gray-green with mold. 900 pounds. Straight to the hogs. She sat on the parlor step until light came up, and she didn't cry about it. She wrote it down instead, in her grandfather's hand-me-down way. Date, depth, ambient temperature, bed temperature at hours 4 and 8, conclusion. The conclusion was 3 words. Too deep, too dry. The fix cost her $90. A length of half-inch copper line run above the floor, drilled with a bit so fine she broke 2 of them, feeding 6 brass mister heads off the well pressure. Fine fog, not spray. Spray beads up and drowns the surface kernels while the middle bakes. She dropped the beds from 8 inches to 4.5, doubled the turning schedule to every 4 hours, all night, alarm clock on a milk crate beside a cot in the parlor. 4.5 inches of grain under a mist that fell like breath. The bed held steady at 61 degrees. The malt that came off that floor was the best she'd ever made, and it was made possible by 900 pounds of ruin. Failure isn't the opposite of a system, it's the tuition. 6,000 pounds by October meant she needed barley, good 2-row, low protein, plump, and the co-op wouldn't sell her a bushel that wasn't already spoken for. So she went at it sideways. She started calling the growers whose loads got docked. Every fall, the co-op's grading table rejected barley for test weight, for staining, for a half point of protein, and paid those men a punishment price of $2.10 a bushel. Take it or haul it home.
Maggie paid $3.40. Cash at the tailgate with a receipt she wrote out herself in duplicate. Turns out a kernel the elevator calls ugly will still wake up and sprout just fine. Malt doesn't care about staining. Malt cares about germination energy, and she tested every load herself. 100 kernels on a wet paper towel in a pie tin, counted at 72 hours. 96 out of 100, she bought it. Below 90, she passed and said so plainly. Word travels through a farm county faster than any telephone. Earl Bowman came up the drive in October with his thermos in one hand and a seed catalog rolled in the other. Silver-gray hair under that faded navy cap, sun red across the forehead, thumbs coming out of his pockets because he needed both hands for once. He'd laughed at her for 2 years. He didn't apologize now, and she didn't ask him to. 20 acres of the North Bottom, he said. What variety you want in it? She looked at the catalog, at the little dark freckle at the corner of his eye, at a man in his late 60s standing in her lot asking a woman of 24 a real question. 2-row. Conlin, if you can get it, and I'll take everything that comes off it at $3.40, graded or not. He wrote it on his hand.
By spring, 3 distilleries in Kentucky were putting her name on their labels. Not the county's name, not the co-op's. Holloway Floor Malt, stamped in small type under the mash bill on a bottle that sold for $58, and buyers asking the bartender what floor malt even meant. Which is precisely when the charcoal gray suit came back. Dale Pritchard's truck rolled into the gravel lot on a Tuesday, and he got out with the chrome clipboard, straight-backed, weight on his heels, hands clasped at that belt buckle like he was about to bless something. Rimless glasses, pale shave line. Same smile he'd worn when he told her, 2 winters ago, that nostalgia wasn't a business plan and that a girl playing farmer with her dead granddad's junk would be renting a trailer in town by Christmas. We'll take your entire output, he said. Taillights in the dust. That's how it ends with men like Dale Pritchard. No shouting, no slammed door. Just a chrome clipboard riding shotgun and a truck backing out of a gravel lot in the dark. Tires crunching. The smell of green malt drifting out of the barn behind him like it was laughing. He'd told her once that she was a hobbyist with a dirt floor. That her grain was garbage and her grandfather was a crank who died broke. He'd said it with that flat, patient smile, the one that assumes you're too slow to catch the insult. And now he'd driven out here, in a pressed pale blue Oxford, to ask if he could put the co-op's label on her name. She said no. Then she went and turned the bed. That fall, she malted 40 tons. Not a projection, 40 actual tons, weighed on the co-op scale, hauled out in bags stenciled by hand. 2 distilleries in Kentucky, 1 in Tennessee, a brewery outside Louisville that ordered 6 tons and then doubled it in March. By 1989, the number was 120. That's when the barn stopped being enough. You can only push a building so far before it starts telling you no. Her steep tanks were repurposed dairy vats. Her germination bed was a concrete slab with a canvas curtain. The air moved because she made it move, dragging a shop fan on an extension cord. And in a wet August, the bed heated in the center, and she lost 4 tons to a sour, sweaty stink that made her stand in the doorway at midnight with her jaw set. Grain molds when it can't breathe. Simple as that. So she stopped patching and started building. The new malt house went up over 11 months. mostly her own hands and Earl Bowman's, who showed up bow-legged with his dented thermos and never once asked to be paid in anything but coffee. The floor was the whole argument. Cast iron perforated plate, salvaged out of a shuttered tobacco warehouse in Bowling Green, laid on a plenum 3 feet deep. Air pushed up through those holes from below, cool and damp, and the grain bed could go 18 inches thick without cooking itself. Above it, she built a kiln with a wind-drawn cowl on the roof, a rotating cap that spun on the prevailing breeze and pulled the hot air up the stack without a single electric fan. Free draft. Cheaper than a motor, and it never breaks. But she turned it by hand. Every batch. A wooden rake, 4 hours, walking the bed in overlapping passes so the rootlets never knitted into a mat. Men from equipment companies came out and offered her a mechanical turner on financing. She looked at the bed and said the rake tells her things a machine won't. That was the whole answer. And the county started to bend. First, it was Harlan Voss, who farmed 300 acres of feed barley 2 ridges over and had spent 3 years calling her the Malt Lady in a tone you could scrape off a boot. He converted 60 acres to a 2-row variety and asked, plainly, hat literally in hand, what protein window she wanted. She told him, 9.5 to 11, 5%, no higher, and don't touch it with late nitrogen. He did what she said. Then 3 more followed him.
By 1992, 4 neighbors were growing malting grade on contract, and the extension office that had once handed her a pamphlet on modern yield management called and asked if she'd come speak at the winter meeting. She wore the same faded olive canvas jacket, same thick auburn braid down her back, loose strands at the temples, her grandfather's brass-cased pocket thermometer hanging on its leather cord. She talked for 19 minutes about moisture curves and steep schedules and never once mentioned Pritchard's name. She didn't have to. Because here's the part that should make you smile. The co-op. The same co-op that stamped her grandfather's barley rejected 3 seasons running and charged him a hauling fee for the privilege, started brokering her grain. They took a commission, and they moved it to distilleries they'd never heard of 5 years earlier. And that rejection stamp, that ugly purple insult that broke an old man's back, became a purchasing category, line item on their sheet, malting grade, high protein exempt, premium. Pritchard still worked there, still parked straight-backed with his hands clasped at his belt buckle. He processed the paperwork on her lots, rimless glasses, capped pen tapping the hinged lid, initialing invoices for a woman he'd once told to sell before she embarrassed herself. Nobody fired him. Nobody needed to. The system he ran just quietly stopped mattering, and he got to watch it happen every single business day. That's the good kind of ending, the kind where the villain keeps his desk. Then 1993 came in dry. 11 inches of rain from April to August, half of normal. Kernels came in shrunken and thin barley is a nightmare for a maltster. It steeps unevenly, germinates ragged, and you get half-modified grain that a distiller will send straight back. Half the county's malting acres failed the screen. Hers didn't. Because of the protocol her grandfather wrote out in 1971 and nobody read for 20 years. Never malt
new crop barley. Store it 6 weeks minimum at under 12% moisture, screened at 55 degrees, and let post-harvest dormancy break on its own schedule. She'd built a bin for it. She kept a floating 4-month reserve, 90 tons of aged grain, sitting cool and quiet while everyone else was scrambling. 9 distilleries called her in 6 weeks. She filled every order on time. Not one late shipment. And the money. Let's put it plain, because the numbers are the argument. Commodity feed barley that year moved at about 5 cents a pound. Her rejection grade, the stuff nobody wanted, cost her 41 cents a pound, landed and screened. She sold finished malt at 68 cents. That's 27 cents of margin on every pound. And at 2,400 pounds an acre of good ground, it comes to roughly $650 an acre against the $120 a feed grower cleared in a good year. 5 times the return, off the crop they told her was worthless. By 1994, she was malting 300 tons a year for 19 distilleries. And the co-op, Pritchard's Co-op, was buying her rejection-grade barley back at her price. The co-op truck comes up the gravel at 7 in the morning, same as it has for 30 years, and backs to the intake door with 11 tons of barley nobody else in the state would touch. Low test weight, skinned kernels, protein running high enough that the big maltsters wave it off with a clipboard and a shrug. It goes down the chute into the steep tanks, and this time, the driver hands over an envelope with the load, because the contract runs the other direction now. They pay her to take the grain they used to charge her a disposal fee on. $75 a load. That was the number. Back when a man in polished black shoes stood in her drive and explained, patiently, smiling, that she was a hobbyist with dirt on her knees. Dale Pritchard's line still gets quoted around here, mostly by people who were standing there when he said it. "Sweetheart, you don't have a business. You have a mess your granddaddy left you, and somebody's going to have to pay to haul it off."
He tapped the capped pen on that chrome clipboard when he said it, twice, like punctuation. He wasn't cruel the way a man with a fist is cruel. He was cruel the way a form letter is cruel. Certain, polite, and absolutely sure you were too small to matter. He retired in '99 to a condo in Bowling Green, and the last thing anyone from the co-op ever asked him about was directions to the parking lot. The malt house runs 3 floors now, steeping in the basement where the limestone stays cold on its own, germination on the main floor, 4 beds, 200 feet of concrete Maggie poured in sections across 9 years because she never once borrowed money to do it. Kilning above, and in the west corner of the top floor, roped off with a length of baling twine, sits the original 1987 kiln, the one she built out of a tobacco barn firebox and salvaged brick, the one that smoked back on her the first 3 firings and taught her more about draft than any book ever did. It hasn't burned a batch since 2003. She won't take it out. Buyers tour through, see it, and ask if it's decorative. She says it's a diagram. The Apprentice is 23. Her name is Nora Van Teen, Claire's niece, which is its own kind of circle, since Claire came up this hill with a brass-cornered notebook and a rubber band around it, expecting to write 4 paragraphs about a curiosity, and instead writing the piece that put 19 distilleries on the phone. Nora came for a summer. She's on year 3. She has flour-fine dust in her eyebrows most days, and she has stopped asking what the meter says. That's the whole training, really. Maggie took the moisture meter away from her in the 2nd month. "Put your arm in it," she said. "Elbow deep. Now tell me." So Nora learned the bed by hand. She learned that a floor at 42 hours feels like a warm animal breathing, that a hot spot reads through the forearm as a wrongness before it ever reads on a probe, that when the rootlets tangle, they knit into a mat that pulls back against your fingers, and that's the moment you turn it or lose it. She learned to smell it. Cucumber first, then apple, then a sweetness like wet hay in sun, and when it slides past that into something sour and closed off, you're late. And she learned the muslin. Maggie tears a strip about 8 inches long, holds it flat at the firebox opening, and watches how it lies. Sucked in tight and steady means the draft is pulling clean. Fluttering means turbulence, a leak somewhere, a damper set wrong. Lifting away from the opening means the fire is pushing back at you and you've got about 90 seconds to fix it before the whole batch tastes like a chimney. Josiah Holloway wrote that trick down in 1961 for curing tobacco. Maggie carried it into malt. Nora holds the strip now with 2 fingers, head tilted, and calls the adjustment before Maggie does about half the time. The germination count hasn't changed either. 100 kernels off the bed, counted into the palm, split with a thumbnail 1 at a time, chalky white through the middle means it's modified. Glassy means it isn't. 94 out of 100 is a pass. Under 90, the bed sits another 6 hours. There's a machine in Louisville that does it in 4 minutes and costs more than the truck. Maggie's had 2 customers ask why she doesn't buy one. "I'll need a reason," she said. That was the whole conversation. Josiah's journals live on a shelf in the office, 41 of them, spines rebound twice in canvas. His handwriting runs to 1979 and stops mid-page on a note about the barn lot drainage. Hers picks up on the next line and runs 40 years past it. Steep schedules, kiln curves, the winter the boiler cracked, the exact weight of every rejected load and what it turned into. Same ledger, no break in it. You can flip through and watch one hand get old and another hand get sure.
Outside, the land tells you the rest. The soil in the barn lot runs dark to a spade's depth now, crumbly, cool, smelling like a cellar. Organic matter tested at 0.5% when she was 24. It reads 4.1. The hedgerows she planted along a north line are 20 feet up and full of birds that eat the things that eat the barley. Earl Bowman's grandson farms the ground across the road on her rotation, and he brings his soil samples up here before he brings them anywhere else. Earl never apologized either. He just started showing up with that dented thermos and staying till dark. Maggie's 71. The braid is silver now, still thick, still down her back. Loose strands at the temples the way they've always been. She unhooks the leather cord from around her neck on a Tuesday in October and puts the brass thermometer into Nora's hand, then sets the stack of journals on the turning rake beside her, on the germination floor, with the bed breathing warm at their feet. Waste is just a failure of imagination, she says. Nora's already got her arm in the barley to the elbow. That's the pattern. Somebody hands you the thing the world priced at nothing, and the price is only ever a measure of who's been looking. Go check what's rotting on your own back 40.